This is the article, Why is the Geography of Russia So Bad? By Navy Blue Nerd. I am Seeing Go, and now I invite you all to listen to this article. Russia, whose full name is the Russian Federation, is a country located in the north of the Eurasian continent, with its east bordering the Pacific Ocean, its north bordering the Arctic Ocean, its west bordering Eastern European countries, and its south bordering China, Mongolia, and Central Asian countries. Russia is the largest country in the world, covering 17 million square kilometers, spanning 11 time zones, equivalent to the historical legacy of the tiny Pluto Principality after the Din Dynasty, and is also the 9th most populous country in the world with 145 million people. Russia has a gigantic geographical structure, with its length reaching up to 8,000 kilometers, a width of 3.2 kilometers, and differences in 2 dimensions. U.S. Vice Presidential candidate Sarah Palin once said, "You can see Russia from the U.S., a statement that was wildly spread by the media.
And I can see Russia from my house.
The truth is, standing from Letterguiomy in Alaska, you can see the Guiomy Way, which is under Russian sovereignty, only 2 miles away. You can actually see Russia from the US. Russia is vast, but its geography has problems. These problems explain why a country of such scale ranks only 12th in GDP and 61st in per capita income. It has a much higher poverty rate compared to countries of similar size, as seen in Canada. And this is due to the foreign policies of past regimes, stemming from Russia's historical origins. If you do not know why Putin is doing what he is doing, then take a look at the beginning, according to Marshall. First, the geographical position. Russia borders 2 oceans, yet it lacks a direct route to an ocean that does not freeze for most of the year. This is the largest oculus of Russia. The seascape on this territory functions as a global force. The analysis has affirmed that one must have a strong military, along with the development of maritime routes to build a strong nation. The most powerful empires almost all have coastlines. Although ancient ambitions existed, the pre-modern era is over. One must always have access to Constantinople and India, because if the masters there prevail, they will dominate the world. There is continuous political mobilization, not only within the territory, but the assistance of Peter G. left an indelible mark on the ruling elites. Russia is not without major ports, but these ports all have one or more geographical limitations. Murmansk, St. Petersburg, and Vladikostok all freeze in winter. Kaliningrad does not freeze, but it is not connected to the rest of Russia. Novorossiysk has a warm water port, but it is not a major port. If a ship from St. Petersburg or Kaliningrad wants to access the open ocean, it must pass through straits controlled by a NATO member. From Novorossiysk, if one wants to leave the sea, it must go through a strait controlled by a NATO member and Turkey. Vladivostok is limited, with poor accessibility due to the absence of a Japanese island, an important ally of the US. The involvement of the Soviet Afghanistan in the late 20th century is also clear evidence of the need for a warm water port for Moscow. The Communist Party members may not favor deploying forces far away, but they are very different from the strategies of Peter J.K. in seeking to access fate on a warm side. Unfortunately, Afghanistan once again became a planting season for empires, when both the Food Empire and the Written Empire got entangled there. The war in Afghanistan has been compared to the Vietnam War of the Soviet Union and led to its collapse. On the part of Ukraine and the Crimean Peninsula, where the climate is warm, there are Russians living and guarding behind steep Stompon. Steve Stompon is an important position in the strategy of Russia thought Neo. Crimea was conquered by the Russian Empire from the time of Catherine the Great and was handed over to the Soviet Socialist Republic Ilkhana under the USSR by Soviet General Secretary Nikita Khrushchev in 1954. A move that could make Queen Catherine and many subsequent Russian leaders rethink their strategy in Crimea. It is hard to imagine Jack Khrushchev then, as everyone thought the USSR would endure, and Crimea would always remain under Moscow's control. Then, the USSR fell into crisis, and the newly established Ilkhana gradually became dependent on the West. Moscow immediately recognized this as a life-or-death issue. If Ilkhana joined NATO and Steve Stompon became a NATO naval base, Russia's maritime power would suffer severe losses. The decision by the referendum, condemned by the United Nations as illegal, did not change the fact that since 2014, in reality, Crimea has remained under Russian control. Russia's naval power is reinforced at Sevastopol, but like Novorossiysk, Russia's access to the open sea remains limited by geography. The occupation of Crimea holds a position merely as a front line in the strategic picture, rather than making Russia a true NATO. NATO leaders have coordinated with one another. On the other side, if Ukraine joins NATO, then we would have to take action. If Russia attacks a NATO member, the treaty provisions would immediately compel a response, and all parties would be obligated. The U.S. established such provisions after the 9/11 terrorist attacks, which brought about NATO's defensive readiness. Russia's access to the oceans would be severely restricted. This would devastate Russia's economy and limit its naval power. NATO understands that adding Crimea would not allow Russia to build a solid infrastructure, and they would seek to encircle Russia. They might let go of Crimea to avoid an all-out war, but Russia would never allow it. Default tech second, comrades in arms. One limiting factor for why Russia does not want to lose this territory is the vast areas known as the Comrade Plains. Because of such vast territories, Russia's regions must be tightly defended. Yet, from these areas, they always focus on protecting key regions. The whole of Russia is protected by its terrain, except for the European part, where 70% of Russians live. Siberia is a natural defense system. No army can invade Russia from the east or the south unless they wish to fight against snow and ice, and harsher conditions to maintain defense capabilities. Thousands of kilometers of supply routes are needed, and there is always the risk of counterattack. This makes it difficult for Central European forces to approach Russia, and the forces of the White Bears can easily occupy Russia from the west, though in Europe it is another matter. Historically, many forces have tried to cut down Russia from the European side, including the Balts, the Swedes, the French, the Turks, and the Germans, and today it is NATO. Facing Russia is a vast gap known as the Comrade Plain. This plain is shaped like a trapezoid with a small part as the Baltics. Extending across the plain up to a large part in the Ural region, it becomes a prearranged path for Western forces to march all the way to Moscow. Since the time of Ivan the Terrible, Russia's foreign policy has always focused on defending Russia from the European side, and the response of its first founder was attack to defend, constantly invading and expanding to create buffer zones to protect Russian territory. That is what Ivan the Terrible and his descendants have executed. Whether you are a prince of the Grand Duchy of Moscow, a royal of the Russian Empire, a supreme leader of Soviet Russia, or a president of Russia, you must always follow this method of defending your country one way or another, either by invading and mobilizing, or by changing authoritarian regimes under the guise of spreading a certain ideology, or by consolidating the economy and diplomacy of those countries into Russia. Therefore, the Russia, whether it is a powerful Russia A resource-dependent Russia, or a Russia that is inherently weak, will always be an empire of Russia. After the collapse of the USSR, Moscow turned towards the west while NATO advanced, connecting the countries that were once Russia's buffer zones, including even the post-Soviet states. Especially 3 countries that are NATO members: Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. This region does not have a pro-Russian government. Under Russia, NATO once extended its attack to the center of Germany. During the Soviet era, just after 2 hours of Ruyi-Leze, Russia had to endure pressure from NATO. Moscow's current buffer zone now consists of only 4 strategic positions, where Russia must maintain its influence: Finland, Kaliningrad, Belarus, and Ukraine. These points almost form a crucial ring on Russia's western border, also composed of 3 countries that are NATO members. NATO also seeks to find a way to penetrate that buffer zone, drawing those countries to its side. That is the reason behind the political upheavals in Belarus and Ukraine, clearly showing Western traces. And you can also see that Moscow has acted very decisively. Belarus, the last independent state in Europe, remains under the control of a pro-Russian government, and President Alexander Lukashenko has held power since 1994 and still remains in office. The relationship between Belarus and Russia was confirmed when Putin repeatedly voiced support for this regime and promised to stand by Lukashenko against the West. After the political crisis erupted and the war swept through Ukraine, that country is no longer under Moscow's protective embrace. Yet the West continues to exert influence over it. Because NATO understands that Ukraine joining the EU or NATO could become a bait for a new conflict. In eastern Ukraine, battles still erupt, and the Russian military forces there have suffered heavy losses. Moscow fights against the secessionist states in eastern Ukraine in the hope of maintaining a buffer zone. Today, Ukraine is led by a pro-Western government. NATO and Ukraine have organized many joint exercises, despite Russia's opposition. Both sides continue to engage in a game of tug-of-war in this country. So why hasn't Russia been burned down? There are 2 reasons why Putin's Russia still copes well with its geographical limitations: oil and natural gas. Russia is the energy powerhouse, especially for fossil fuels, with the largest volume of gas exports in the world, the highest gas export, and it has the 8th largest oil reserves. Not to mention, the huge reserves may lie beneath the northern lands and the oil and gas fields in Siberia, with its largest customer being the EU. Many countries need to depend on Russia for energy. Most developed countries are almost entirely dependent on Russia for oil. Eastern European countries depend on it by about 60%, and some countries import more than half of their gas from Russia. There is a network of pipelines that Russia fully controls, which can increase or decrease flow. If Russia stops exporting, those countries would face a severe energy shortage for about 60 days. This also explains why some countries seem less eager to condemn Russia, compared to those that are less dependent on Russian energy, such as the United Kingdom. Countries with good relations with Russia pay less for energy, like Finland. Of course, the EU tends to diversify its energy sources, for example, by investing in gas pipelines from the US or the Middle East. However, the wide dependency on Russian oil and gas will be hard to change in this century. An economy too dependent on oil like Russia is not a strong economy, but it can maintain oil and natural gas as 2 soft power factors for manipulation. Can Vladimir Putin or any of his leaders successfully implement such strong policies? Or perhaps Russia's fate is already predetermined that it cannot become a superpower. Certainly, geography is not everything that makes a nation powerful, but history has proven that that it is a decisive factor in the development and decline of a country. From the Grand Duchy of Moscow to Russia, the Russian Federation today, Russian governments and leaders have always faced similar issues. Regardless of whether Russia's ideology changes from monarchy to communism or democracy, the geographical issues of Russia remain. The frozen land, the icy seas, are in a disadvantaged position. This is a reality that has been proven since the time of Ivan the Terrible and has not yet been overcome.